Jackson Whitmore stood at the edge of his glass-walled penthouse, a god in a world he no longer admired, staring down at the glowing Manhattan skyline like it was a kingdom he ruled, but never asked for. His tailored charcoal suit clung to his broad frame like armor, his blue eyes sharp, cold, and lifeless behind the glimmer of wealth that never warmed him. Behind him, laughter echoed across the grand hall of his charity gala, the rich drinking champagne while tossing pity money at causes they barely remembered the next day, and among them stood his circle other heirs, stock wolves, fame-fed parasites who masked boredom with bravado, each one feeding off the same poison of pride, until one of them, Carter, raised his glass with a smirk, eyes locked on Jackson as he said, "You know what your problem is, Whitmore? You've never been with a real woman, a woman untouched by our world, unshaped by city games, someone raw, someone real," and the others chuckled, jabbing at Jackson's reputation for ice-cold flings and passionless entanglements with models who knew the rules better than they knew his last name. But Jackson didn't blink, just sipped his aged scotch and let the silence sting before he said flatly, "And what would a real woman even look like to you?" And that's when the dare was born, cruel and intoxicating, whispered between clinks of crystal and smirks too polished to be sincere. Go tame a virgin farm girl, make her fall in love in one weekend, then walk away. And while most took it as a joke, Jackson's pride took it personally, because he was a man who never walked away from a challenge, even one that tasted like sin. And so with a few keystrokes, he summoned his assistant, booked a jet, and pulled up a list of small rural towns no one from Wall Street had ever heard of. He chose Kansas not for its appeal but for its obscurity, the kind of place untouched by skyscrapers and scandals, a place where hearts weren't worn like accessories but buried deep in the soil. And as his private plane cut across the clouds, Jackson looked out at the sky and told himself it was a game, nothing more. Something to win, but deep down, beneath the armor of wealth and ego, something restless stirred. Meanwhile, Savannah Grace Miller was brushing down her horse under the wide Kansas sky, wearing worn-out jeans and a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of lavender and hay, her fingers rough from labor yet delicate in touch, her emerald eyes reflecting the soul of someone who had known sacrifice far too early and yet never let bitterness grow roots in her spirit. Lived with her younger brother and widowed mother on the edge of a fading farm, where the crops often failed but love never did, where dinners were humble and laughter came freely, and though she'd never seen the inside of a ballroom or stepped on city pavement, her dreams were stitched quietly into her pillow each night, and her heart, though untouched, was no stranger to aching. So when a shiny black SUV rolled into town, and a man stepped out wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses that looked like they cost more than her barn, her breath caught not because of his looks, which were arresting, or his presence, which sucked air from the sky, but because of the way he stared at everything like he didn't belong yet, believed the world owed him a place. And when he walked into the local diner asking about farm properties, his voice smooth as silk over gravel, she met his eyes for the first time. And for a brief second, the earth stilled the billionaire. Expecting simplicity, found a girl whose gaze unsettled him like an old wound reopened, her smile guarded yet kind, her movements soft but rooted in strength. And in that moment, Jackson realized he hadn't come to tame hair. He had come unprepared for the storm. Her soul was capable of stirring. The following morning, golden light spilled through the lace curtains of the Miller farmhouse. As Jackson sat stiffly at the edge of a modest wooden breakfast table, the smell of fresh cornbread and brewed coffee rising like an offering to simplicity he never knew he craved. And across from him sat Savannah, elbows on the table, scribbling something in a notebook while pretending not to study him, though her eyes betrayed every guarded glance. He'd introduced himself as a travel writer, interested in capturing the forgotten beauty of rural life, and while her mother welcomed him warmly, Savannah wasn't so quick to trust the man whose boots looked too new and whose handshake felt rehearsed. Yet something about the quiet effort he made, like offering to chop wood or help gather eggs, slowed her suspicion enough to let her curiosity breathe, even as she watched him bungle with a shovel like it was a foreign object. And still, he returned each day with rolled-up sleeves and an awkward grin that tugged at something hidden behind her ribs. Jackson, used to commanding boardrooms with confidence and silence, found himself fumbling over words in front of her words that came too fast or too polished, falling flat against her unpretentious honesty. And he noticed things he never had before, like the way her hair escaped its braid during chores, or how she hummed old country songs without realizing it, and when she laughed, really laughed, didn't flirt, it didn't beg. It simply echoed through the open fields like something untainted. And he didn't know why, but he found himself chasing that sound more than any profit margin he'd ever calculated. He watched her from the porch one evening as she carried baskets of strawberries from the garden, sun painting her skin with a warm glow, and for a moment, he saw her not as part of a dare, but as something devastatingly real, too real for a man made of masks. Yet he stayed, weaving himself into their world day by day, learning how to adjust the barn latch and where the rooster liked to hide, watching her every time she rolled up her sleeves with purpose and not for appearance. Her strength, defying the fragile image his world painted of femininity, and the more he saw her fight the day with grit, the more his chest ached at the thought of leaving. At night, the silence between their rooms was filled with tension too delicate to name, like something sacred lived in that space unspoken but felt, and he would lay on the creaky mattress, staring at the wooden ceiling, remembering how her fingers brushed his arm when she passed him the lemonade jug, or how her eyes softened just before she turned away when he complimented her pie. And each detail stitched itself into his thoughts like memories he hadn't earned. Yet the guilt haunted him like a shadow at dusk. The bet, the lie, the reason he was here at all throbbed beneath his skin every time she looked at him with tentative trust, unaware of the storm he carried beneath his tailored words and clean-cut charm. And he hated how natural it felt to lie to her, to laugh beside her little brother, while pretending he wasn't the very danger this family didn't see coming. He tried to write something in a real notebook to look convincing, travel notes, farm impressions, but all he wrote were fractured thoughts about her. Her boots with the hole near the heel, the way she snorted when something was really funny, how she said thank you, like it still meant something in this world. And the weight of those details suffocated him because they weren't part of the dare. They were parts of her, and she was becoming more than the mission, more than the joke, more than the silence that used to protect him. One afternoon, she found a pair of high heels in a donation box, meant for church, deep red and a size too big. And for fun, she wore them while picking strawberries just to feel silly for once. And when he saw her wobbling through the grass in those shoes with mud on her knees and laughter in her breath, his heart clenched with an ache he couldn't name, because she wasn't trying to impress him or seduce him. She was just being Savannah, untouched by city rules or curated charm. And for the first time, Jackson realized he wasn't playing the game anymore, he was losing it. Because every second he stayed, every secret he kept, every moment she let him into her quiet life was a thread unraveling his carefully constructed world. And still he said nothing, just smiled when she tossed him a strawberry and said, "Don't get used to this hospitality," her tone teasing but her eyes scanning his for something deeper, something buried. And when he looked back, his throat tightened with words he couldn't say. Not yet, not with everything on the line, not with a lie so big it could shatter the innocence that had unknowingly become the most sacred thing he'd ever touched without laying a hand on it. The sky cracked open like a secret too long kept, thunder rolling across the fields with a wrath that felt personal. And as Savannah ran barefoot across the muddy yard, chasing after her little brother's cries, the horizon twisted into a monstrous funnel of wind that swallowed trees and silence alike, its roar louder than any memory. Jackson, who had never faced anything more dangerous than a bad stock drop, sprinted toward the collapsing barn without hesitation, shoes sinking into soaked earth as he forced the door open, the wind clawing at his back like some vengeful ghost. And inside, he found the boy huddled behind feed sacks, wide-eyed and trembling, calling out for Savannah with a voice cracking under fear. In that instant, nothing about Jackson felt like a Leahy wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a man hiding secrets. She was just human, breathless and desperate, shielding a child from falling timber as he carried him out, arms bruised, lungs burning, heart pounding with something heavier than fear. And when the barn roof gave one final groan behind him and collapsed just seconds after they escaped, the shock of near death wasn't what made his legs buckle. Was the way Savannah threw herself at her brother and then looked up at Jackson like she was seeing the man beneath the suit for the first time, as if bravery had peeled something off his skin that words never could. They all took shelter in the storm cellar afterward, the wind howling like a beast outside while firelight flickered against damp walls inside, casting soft shadows over shaken faces. Savannah, wrapped in a blanket, watched Jackson from across the room, her thoughts loud in her silence, her eyes tracing the cut above his brow, the way his chest rose unevenly, and something inside her shifted, a quiet surrender blooming in the space where suspicion used to live. And when he finally met her gaze, it held no armor, no games. Just a man torn between what he came to do and who he had become. She moved toward him slowly, each step deliberate, the storm above now a distant echo. And when she sat beside him, their shoulders barely touching, he spoke not with practiced charm, but with the fragile weight of truth, his voice rough from smoke and guilt as he told her, "I'm not really a writer. I mean, I write, but that's not why I came here." And she didn't flinch, just waited. Because some truths are understood before they're spoken. And though he didn't tell her about the bet, he gave her something close. He told her he'd been searching for something real, something to remind him he wasn't just made of boardrooms and balance sheets. And her presence had unnerved him from the beginning, because it made him feel like the boy he once was, before ambition consumed his name. Savannah didn't interrupt, didn't question, just reached out with a trembling hand and touched his face, her fingers grazing the bruise near his temple, like she was tracing every broken part he tried to hide. And when their eyes met, there was no storm left to fear, only the quiet, terrifying closeness of two people standing on the edge of something they never planned for. Her mother's warning echoed the next day like thunder returning. "City men don't love farm girls, honey. They only pass through." But Savannah's heart had already begun its quiet descent, slipping past the defenses she'd spent years building, and it terrified her more than the tornado ever could. Because Jackson wasn't supposed to matter, wasn't supposed to hold her gaze the way he did while helping clean up fallen branches, wasn't supposed to make her smile when he offered to fix the fence with hands that still shook from adrenaline. And yet, there he was, silent in all the right places, present in a way that no one had ever been, and she hated that it felt safe, hated how natural it felt to lean toward him when he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and looked like he was about to say something he didn't know how to begin. Jackson, for all his charm and control, was unraveling, every glance from her a thread tugged loose, every word of kindness a wound he didn't know how to bandage. And he knew deep in his marrow that what had started as a game now felt like punishment for every time he'd laughed at love. Because Savannah wasn't a challenge, she was a mirror, and in her, he saw everything he'd been running from. The ache to belong, the desire to be chosen for nothing but the truth of who he was beneath the layers. And it scared him more than any storm ever could. And so, in the hush of that long evening, with twilight bleeding across the sky and smoke rising lazily from the chimney, Jackson stood beside Savannah on the porch, both of them watching the stars reappear after chaos, neither speaking, but both knowing that something between them had shifted irrevocably, that love, fragile and terrifying, was no longer a stranger knocking from outside, but a presence growing louder within the cracks of two broken lives, trying, perhaps, to mend each other in the silence that followed the storm. Jackson lingered on the porch long after Savannah had gone inside, the stars above mocking his silence with their honest glow. And as the soft creak of the old screen door faded behind her, he stood there gripping the edge of the railing like it might hold him together, because every moment in this town, every second in her orbit, was unraveling the man he used to be. Guilt, thick and sharp like barbed wire, twisted inside him each time she glanced over her shoulder with that quiet smile. The one she didn't know was slowly killing him, because it carried the kind of trust he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. He told himself he'd walk away soon, end the lie, leave before the truth shattered her completely, but then she'd laugh while making dinner, or thank him softly after he helped fix a fence post, and the vow would fade under the warmth of her presence like ink left in the rain. Her innocence wasn't inexperience, it was strength, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. And the deeper he sank into her world of wildflowers, chores, and early morning coffee, the more Manhattan felt like a bad dream he hadn't fully woken from. And then came the night of her brother's birthday, fairy lights strung across the beams of the old barn, paper lanterns swaying in the breeze, laughter echoing from a dozen neighbors gathered in folding chairs, and in the soft chaos of cake and music, Savannah had grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the empty middle of the floor, with a grin that dared him to be someone else for a night. "I don't dance," he muttered, but she just kicked off her shoes and said, "Good, because I do," before placing her bare feet gently atop his polished ones, her hands light on his shoulders, her breath sweet with strawberries and something heartbreakingly hopeful. And as they swayed in slow circles beneath the soft glow of twinkling lights, time thinned around them like the fragile silence before range. Didn't tease, didn't flirt, just rested her head near his collarbone and hummed the melody like it was the only thing that kept the walls from falling down around them. His heart pounded louder than the music, louder than the memory of why he came. And when he looked down at heartless woman who wore freckles like constellations and carried kindness like armor, found himself saying things he didn't plan. You don't belong here forever. His voice low, unsure whether it was a wish or a warning. And she looked up at him, her green eyes unreadable before she whispered back, maybe someone like you doesn't belong in the city either. And something inside him collapsed. Something long kept at bay by pride and cruelty and boardroom bravado. Because she wasn't just special, she was dangerous. The kind of woman who could make a man forget why he ever learned to lie. But just as the spell had begun to settle around them, like silk slipping through tired fingers, the shrill buzz of his phone cut through the quiet. And while Savannah fetched drinks for her brother, Jackson stepped outside to answer at Carter's voice on the other end, mocking and sharp, slicing through the magic with every syllable. So, lover boy, how's the farm girl? You win the bet yet, or still playing country hero? And though Jackson didn't speak, didn't answer, didn't breathe, the damage was done, the illusion cracked, because the weight of the lie surged back like a flood he could no longer hold back with half-truths and good intentions. He returned inside, hollowed out, smiling on the surface but shattered beneath. And Savannah, glowing from the laughter of the evening, didn't notice the tremble in his hand as she leaned up and kissed his cheek, slow and soft and sincere, before whispering, I think I'm falling for you, the words catching in the air like fireflies between them, fragile, bright, irreversible. And Jackson, standing in the ruins of what could have been something real, felt the crushing ache of his own betrayal settle into his bones like winter. Because he hadn't just lied to her, he'd let her open herself while knowing the knife sat waiting behind his back. And though she still saw him as the man who ran into the storm and danced barefoot in barns, he now saw himself as the coward who built intimacy on a dare, who let her fall while knowing the floor beneath her heart was already cracking. And when she pulled away, smiling like hope still lived in her chest, Jackson barely managed a nod, because anything more would have broken them both too soon. And as she walked away that night, unaware of the war raging inside the man she'd unknowingly saved, he stood alone under the same stars, hands shaking, breath stolen, and soul unraveling under the weight of what he'd done, what he hadn't said, and the unbearable truth that for the first time in his hollow, shining life he wasn't just falling in love, he was drowning in it. The night after Savannah whispered her feelings into the curve of his cheek, Jackson couldn't sleep. He kept hearing her voice play back in his mind, soft and certain, echoing like the final chime of a bell he couldn't unring. And by morning, he knew he couldn't carry the weight of his silence forever. But still, he followed her when she tugged his hand and asked him to come with her, her smile gentle, knowing, hopeful, as they slipped past the barn and followed a worn path through rows of tall, whispering cornstalks that swayed with the evening breeze like sentinels guarding a memory. The golden hour painted her skin in warm light, and she walked barefoot through the soil as though the earth belonged to her spirit, the hem of her white sundress fluttering just above her knees, her loose hair cascading down her back in soft waves. He longed to memorize with his hands. When they reached the clearing, a small open space surrounded by wildflowers and crowned with open sky, he realized he was standing at the heart of her soul, a place untouched by anyone else. And when she knelt on the old woven blanket, motioning for him to join her, he did so without question, though his chest pulsed with conflict. For a while they said nothing, only watching as fireflies emerged from the dusk, blinking like shy stars closer to earth. And when she finally asked, her voice barely more than a breath, "Will you leave?" he couldn't meet her eyes, because the answer was layered in truths he hadn't told her yet. So instead he stared at his hands, dirt still beneath his nails from helping in the field, and murmured, "I don't know what I came here for anymore, but I know what I want to stay for." And in that moment, the air shifted, something silent and sacred passing between them like a current neither could resist. Savannah leaned forward slightly, and he reached out without thinking, his hand trembling as his fingers brushed her cheek, tracing the soft line of her jaw with reverence, not entitlement, as if he were asking permission to exist in her world just a little longer. Their eyes held for one breath, two, before his lips met hers, not with hunger or urgency, but with a slowness that felt infinite, like time paused to witness something true. And as they kissed beneath the open sky, there was no trace of the dare, no echo of deception, only the fragile, blooming ache of two people caught between truth and timing. When they pulled apart, her forehead rested gently against his, eyes closed, and for the first time, peace settled between them like a blanket, warm and weightless. They lay down side by side, the cornstalks rustling like whispers around them, their hands finding each other in the grass, fingers interlocking naturally, without question or condition. And though neither spoke, the silence was full of hope, of breath, of things neither had the courage to say aloud, but both understood in the rhythm of their hearts. Jackson stared at the stars, feeling their vastness press against his chest. And for once, he didn't feel small beneath them. He felt seen, held by something as real as her touch. And Savannah, eyes open beside him, watched him in the moonlight, wondering if maybe love didn't need grand declarations, but quiet moments like this, where nothing had to be proven, only felt. And yet, miles away, in a place still tied to his past, voices stirred, secrets itched to be heard, and the lie, though tucked away for now, began to rattle beneath the weight of this delicate truth, reminding him with cruel precision that borrowed time eventually comes due. The lie didn't explode, it leaked slowly, unnoticed at first, like a wound beneath the skin, but a week later, in the fragile calm that followed their shared night beneath the stars, the quiet shattered. Savannah hadn't been eavesdropping. Not really, she was just walking back to the farmhouse with a basket of eggs, her bare feet brushing through the dew-kissed grass, when she heard Jackson's voice coming from behind the old barn, low and sharp, slicing through the morning with the kind of edge he'd never shown her before, and she paused, hidden by the corner, her body rooted in place as if her heart already knew it was about to break. "Yeah," he said, voice tight, businesslike, cruel in a way she didn't recognize. "The dare's over. I won. No, I didn't sleep with her, but I got what I needed." And in that single moment, her world collapsed, not loudly, not in flames, but in that quiet, suffocating way heartbreak does when it comes with no warning. Just a sentence, just a tone, just a truth that tastes like betrayal. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't gasp for breath caught in her throat like a held scream. Her fingers went numb. The basket dropped, eggs cracking against the earth. But she didn't hear them, didn't care, didn't feel anything except the raw, jagged emptiness carving through her chest. And she walked away before he saw her, her face a mask of calm, though her soul bled beneath the silence. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a confrontation, didn't scream or demand answers, because some pain is too sacred to share with the one who caused it. So instead, she packed quietly, slowly folding the white sundress she wore that night, the one that still held the ghost of his kiss, and wrote a note that carried more weight than any goodbye ever could. "You were the first man I trusted. I guess that was my biggest mistake." And when he returned to the farmhouse that evening with wildflowers in hand and a smile in his eyes, he found her room empty, the closet door open, the bed made, and the only trace of her left behind was that note sitting like a tombstone on her pillow, ink still fresh, finality bleeding from every curve of her handwriting. Time froze as he read it, and then the world inside him fractured. He called her name, once, twice, 3 times, his voice growing hoarse with disbelief, denial, desperation. But the silence that answered back was brutal and absolute. Her mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sad, but firm. "She's gone, Jackson. She didn't tell anyone where. And after what you did, I doubt she ever will." He didn't argue. What could he say? What apology could touch the depth of what he'd destroyed? He drove to the airport like a man fleeing a crime scene, because guilt followed him in the rearview mirror and sat in the passenger seat like a ghost. When he returned to Manhattan, the city lights didn't blind him anymore, they exposed him. The elevator in his penthouse felt like a coffin, the boardroom like a funeral, his tailored suits suddenly foreign, like costumes on a stage where no one applauded anymore, and he stared at his reflection for hours into eyes that once held ambition and now only held regret, into a face that had once been proud and now looked like a stranger wearing shame like cologne. Nothing made sense. Deals fell apart. Phone calls went unanswered. His appetite vanished. And every night he stared at his phone hoping for a text that would never come, scrolling through her photos in secret like a thief who had stolen something irreplaceable and didn't know how to return it. He tried to go back to who he was before her, but that man was gone, killed, not by love, but by his inability to honor it. One night, as rain tapped against his windows and the world outside blurred into gray, he snapped through his phone across the room, shattered a vase, dropped to his knees like a child who lost his mother in a crowd. Because the ache of losing Savannah wasn't just heartbreak, it was soul-deep collapse, a reckoning, and when he looked around at his sprawling apartment with its cold walls and expensive emptiness, he knew this wasn't home. It never had been. The only place that ever felt like belonging was in a cornfield under fairy lights, with a barefoot girl who smelled like wildflowers and kissed like truth. The next morning, he boarded a private jet with no destination, only a name in his heart and a prayer in his lungs, flying back to Kansas as if returning to the scene of a crime. But when he arrived, the farm was quiet to quieten, Savannah was gone, the rooms stripped of her laughter, the fields silent without her humming, and every neighbor he asked just shook their heads with soft sympathy. She needed space. She didn't say where, but she won't be easy to find, son. And for the first time in his life, Jackson couldn't buy what he wanted, couldn't call a favor or pull a string because what he'd lost wasn't a thing to be chased. It was a heart he'd been trusted with and betrayed. He sat on her porch that night, alone, the wind howling like it was grieving with him, and as darkness swallowed the sky, he realized the cruel irony of it all. He didn't win a game. He didn't conquer a dare. He didn't prove anything except how tragically easy it is to destroy something beautiful with arrogance. In trying to win, he had only lost to not just the girl, but the man he could have been if he'd chosen honesty over ego, truth over pride, love over a lie, and now, with nothing left but the echo of her goodbye and the hollow ache of her absence, Jackson Whitmore, billionaire, charmer, winner of a stupid bay, was finally, utterly, heartbreakingly alone. Jackson hadn't known how long he sat on that porch in Kansas, the wind wrapping around him like regret. But when the morning light broke and the birds began to sing songs she used to hum, he stood not with purpose, but with need, the kind that doesn't ask permission or wait for answers, only pulls a man forward by the collar of his guilt and the thread of hope he refuses to cut. He left the keys to his penthouse on the boardroom table, stripped the title of CEO from his name, and walked away from everything that once defined him, because none of it mattered anymore. Not the stocks, not the suits, not the luxury. No one shared with him, and he spent the next several months moving across forgotten towns, volunteering at barns and feeding animals, working in the dirt beside people who didn't know his name and didn't care, donating anonymously to farming families who couldn't afford to plant their seasons, chasing the kind of purpose that didn't come with applause, but healed something in his chest, each time a stranger smiled with their hands covered in soil. He carried Savannah's note folded in his wallet like scripture, read it under moonlight and snowfall, and whispered apologies into the wind like it could carry them to her, hoping desperately, quietly, that maybe one day forgiveness might have a face again. And then, as if fate had been waiting for him to prove he'd changed not just in words but in soul, it happened on a frozen December evening in a sleepy town in Vermont, where the streets were dressed in twinkling lights and laughter steamed through the air like chimney smoke. Jackson wandered through a small farmer's market near the town square, his gloves in one pocket, his heart pounding without warning when he saw her. Time stilled the kind of stillness that happens only once in a man's life, because there, beneath a wooden booth dusted in snow, Savannah stood arranging jars of homemade jam beside a younger boy he instantly recognized as her brother, taller now, smiling as he helped a customer, and she looked different. Her hair was longer, her posture stronger, her aura quieter but more powerful, and yet her hands still moved with the grace of the girl who once danced barefoot under barn lights. And Jackson couldn't breathe, because her presence hit him like a memory laced with thunder. Their eyes met across the space between pumpkins and pine wreaths, and in that single glance, he felt everything he lost, everything he broke, everything he still loved with an ache that had never dulled Dan. She stared back with a flicker of recognition, surprise, and the faintest tremble of old pain buried under resolve. Before she could turn, before the moment could dissolve like snow in palms, Jackson walked forward. No, he dropped to his knees right there on the frosted pavement, among strangers holding cider cups and carolers pausing mid-song. his breath visible and shaking, his hands trembling as he looked up at her, not like a man who wanted to be forgiven, but like one who had spent every hour since losing her becoming worthy of even her gaze. People stopped to watch, whispers growing, but he didn't care, not about eyes, not about pride, not about image, because nothing else existed in that moment except the woman in front of him and the truth he had waited months to say. His voice raw as he spoke. There was a dare. I was stupid, cruel, arrogant. But it ended the day I realized I couldn't breathe without you. It ended the second you trusted me. And I've hated myself every single day since I shattered that trust. I didn't deserve your love, but I never stopped loving you. And for a moment, Savannah didn't speak, her hand still holding the jam jar. Her breath caught halfway between disbelief and memory, but tears welled in her eyes, glistening under the warm glow of holiday lights, and her brother quietly stepped back, understanding something sacred was unfolding. Her lips parted, but her voice was fragile as she asked, "Would you ever lie to me again?" And Jackson, eyes red, whispered with more weight than any vow he'd ever made in his life, "Never." Not even in silence. And the world around them faded. No vendors, no wind, no cameras, just a girl once broken and a man once blind, standing in the snow between past and possibility. And then she stepped forward, her body shaking not from cold but from release, and wrapped her arms around him, not tightly at first, not with certainty, but with a slow, trembling embrace, like a soul remembering the shape of home. And he clung to her like a man holding a lifeline thrown from heaven. The crowd applauded quietly, respectfully, as if they too felt the gravity of what had just been restored. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but something rarer. A love that survived truth, endured shame, and rose from its own ashes, not untouched but unafraid. Her tears fell into his shoulder, his fingers tangled in her coat, and they didn't speak for a long time, because some healing doesn't need words, only presence, only proofed in that embrace. Jackson knew forgiveness wasn't a door swung open, but a slow turn of the knob, a cautious step into a room once burned, now rebuilt with hands that finally knew what they held. Savannah leaned back just enough to see his face, her fingers brushing the stubble on his jaw, her eyes searching his like she was reading every page of the man he'd become, and whatever she found there, it was enough, because she nodded, once, firm and trembling, and said softly, "I missed you more than I wanted to." And he almost collapsed at the weight of it, the grace of it, the gift of being let back in, not to her life, but to her heart, which was the only place he ever truly belonged. That night, they sat on the bench near her booth, snow falling like confetti around them, sipping hot chocolate her brother brought over, and he listened to her speak of the months she spent rebuilding herself, of the therapy she went to in secret, of the strength she discovered in solitude, and he told her of every farm he worked on, every letter he wrote but never sent, every mistake he learned from, and every way he vowed never to make her doubt again. And when the market lights dimmed and the town settled into the hush of winter, Jackson stood with her under a lamppost glowing gold and asked quietly, reverently, "Can we start again?" And she nodded, this time with a small smile, because sometimes love doesn't return like a lightning strike or a miracle. It finds its way back in the snow, at a farmer's market, between old wounds and new vows, held in arms that once failed and now know how to hold. And for the first time since that lie shattered her world, Savannah chose to believe in love again, not because it was easy, but because he had finally made it safe.